If you served in the military in the 80s or were part of a special forces unit in the 90s, there's something nobody probably told you back then. That the British SAS, the very men who had spent decades considering themselves the most respected elite unit in the Western world, walked away from a joint exercise on Spanish soil without saying a word. And for them, that was the highest possible recognition. Today, you're going to find out exactly what happened, where it happened, and why it changed the way Spanish Special Forces understood their own worth. Block 1, the man, to understand what happened, you have to place yourself in the 1980s. Spain had just joined NATO in 1982, a country entering military alliances decades behind its European partners. Militarily, we were still an army that had spent 40 years looking inward. But Special Forces were a different story. Since the 1960s, the Compañías de Operaciones Especiales, the COEs, had been training under conditions that many European allies had never even imagined, without dedicated helicopters, without immediate air support, without the budgets France or the United Kingdom had. They trained in the Sierra de Guadarrama in boots that weighed like bricks, in the Sierra Nevada at -12 degrees, with rations that sometimes never arrived, in the Pyrenees with radio equipment that failed more often than it worked. If you went through training in those years, you know exactly what we're talking about. It wasn't romanticism, it was necessity. The set-me you carried weighed 4.5 kilos without the magazine. The Z-42 helmet squeezed your head like a vice, and a full combat pack hovered around 30 kilos when you were loaded up for real. Under those conditions, a generation of Spanish soldiers was forged, men who never knew what it was to have guaranteed logistical support. And that, without yet knowing it, was going to be their greatest advantage. Lock 2. The encounter the first. Serious contact between Spanish Special Forces units and the British SAS in joint NATO exercises took place in the mid-1980s as part of the agreements for integration into the alliance's military structure. There was no fanfare, no welcome speeches. 2 elite units, same terrain, shared mission. The men of the Special Air Service arrived with a doctrine already codified through decades of real operations. The Falklands was recent history. Northern Ireland had been their school. They had procedures for absolutely everything, written down and tested. The Spanish arrived with something different, the ability to improvise when the plan falls apart, the endurance of men who had learned to function when nothing works. In the first days of the exercise, the differences were visible, but without a clear hierarchy. The British executed with an almost mechanical precision. The Spanish reacted with a flexibility that observers struggled to categorize. It wasn't indiscipline, it was a different kind of discipline. If you're watching this video and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week we recover stories like this one that you won't find anywhere else. Hit the red button and turn on the bell. Block 3. The exercise that changed everything, but it was one specific test that marked a before and an after, a survival and navigation exercise in mountain terrain, 5 days, in a zone of the Aragonese Pyrenees near Jaca, with elevations exceeding 2,000 meters. Night temperatures below zero. No fire permitted the first 2 nights to avoid detection. The instructions were simple. Reach a series of checkpoints scattered across the terrain in whatever order each unit deemed best, with no outside support. No resupply, no emergency communications except in extreme cases, no guaranteed food beyond what you carried on your back and what you could find. 30 kilos on your shoulders, boots that had been wet for 3 days already, the map, the compass, and whatever you'd learned. Does that ring a bell? Because if you went through serious field exercises in those years, you know exactly that smell. the smell of wet clothing, pine, and real exhaustion. By the fourth day, some elements of the British unit began to feel the terrain in ways their commanders hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a lack of physical preparation, that was impeccable. It was that they had planned the exercise with a support logic that simply didn't exist here. When the plan can't be executed exactly as written, you have to reinvent it, and reinventing isn't always in the manual. The Spanish unit arrived complete at the final checkpoint. No exercise casualties, no men out, the same number they had started with. There were no applause, no scoreboard on any wall, but there were looks, and in the world of special operations, looks say more than reports. Block 4. What each side learned. What happened after that exercise is the most interesting part. The Spanish commanders didn't come out feeling superior. That would have been a massive mistake, and they knew it. What they took away was a list of things the SAS did better than anyone. Process documentation was impeccable. Every procedure was written, reviewed, and tested. If a man went down, the next one could take his role because everything was recorded. Spain didn't have that culture yet, not at that level. Technological integration was years ahead. Communication systems, night vision, individual equipment. The gap was real and had no immediate solution. Tactical planning was a work of engineering. Every contingency had been anticipated. Every decision node identified. They noted it down. They brought it back. And in the years that followed, part of that influence filtered into the doctrine of what would eventually become the MOE, the Mando de Operaciones Especiales, created in 1987 as the unified structure for all elite units of the Spanish Army. But the learning wasn't one-directional. And that's the part that almost never gets told. If you served in Special Forces or know someone who did in those years, drop it in the comments. What base were you at? What do you remember from those first NATO exercises? Those testimonies are what make this channel exist. Block 5, what the British didn't expect. British observers saw something in those exercises they hadn't anticipated, a mountain terrain endurance that was not the result of a specific training program. It was the product of years of operating without a safety net. When you don't have a helicopter guaranteed, you learn to walk further. When you don't have assured resupply, you learn to manage what you have to the limit. When the radio fails, you learn to navigate without it. That capacity for adaptation, that ability to maintain group cohesion when the plan falls apart, proved just as effective in certain conditions as any advanced system. This isn't a judgment, it's a statement of fact. There are two ways to create an elite operator. One based on resources, structure, and technology. Another based on adaptation, endurance, and the capacity to improvise under extreme pressure. In the joint exercises of the 1980s and 90s, Spain proved that the second one works too, and the respect that generated didn't appear in any official communiqué, but those who were there remember it. Today, the MOE is fully integrated into NATO standards. The technology is on par with any ally, the resources comparable. But there is something that remains in the culture of those units, something that goes back much further, the conviction that if tomorrow everything else fails, what remains is the man, and that is exactly what was put to the test in those Pyrenees. Not the flag, not the budget, not the manual. If this video reminded you of something you lived through or something someone who was there told you, write it below. No judgment here, just memory.